Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are across the globe. Welcome to the GIMI Think Tank. The GIMI Think Tank brings exciting speakers to the table to exchange ideas that are supposed to move you into insights and insights into actions. Every year, every day, every week, we either find a speaker who's going to talk about an important trend that's going to change the world, or about new ways to do innovation management, or what might be going that's fascinating in any one country. Today, we've got a fantastic speaker who's going to tell us about the transitions that are happening in energy. And this trend, just to be very clear, this is $1 trillion trend. $1 trillion trend, whereas energy transitions from oil and gas into green, into solar, into wind, into hydro, those transitions are going to create opportunities, jobs, economies, industries that we have not even imagined before. I believe we're going to have a great, insight today as we listen to Felipe talk. Felipe comes previously from PwC, and then he worked as a consultant, working in a firm on actually energy and renewables, and in Belgium. And then more recently, he is now at Columbia University as a fellow, a global leadership fellow at Columbia. And he is actually working on Colombia's Global Energy Policy Center and writing out a bill for what the energy transition should be around the hydrogen economy in Colombia. So with that, we can start presenting. Felipe, I'm really happy that you are here. You are right now physically where? Are you in New York, or where are you physically at this moment?
Yes, I'm currently in New York, and well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's amazing to be here with all of you, and I hope the content that I'm going to share, well, at least gives you the main insights of the challenges we're living right now in the transition.
And before you start your presentation, just to bring things to life, something personal about yourself, married, kids, sports.
Sure, yeah, well, I came here to New York with my wife and a little kid. I have a little child who is 19 months. And basically, well, I come from Colombia, and you know that at the regional scale in Latin America, well, we have all of the resources required at the end to underpin these transitions. So this is basically what has encouraged me towards this commitment and working specifically at the center of the global energy policy, where it's really interesting to talk with all of the experts around the world, former ministers and experts and SMEs and scholars that have worked on this through all the perspective on technology. So yeah, this is where my personal and professional passion at the end meet.
Just a quick question for you. I mean, clearly you've been doing energy for a long time, even as consultant and everything else also. Where did that start? Where did you recognize that it's important to work on renewables, reusables? Was it as a young child? Was it in college? Where was the day you said, this is it, this is the topic, this is what I want to work on?
That's a great question, because I started in energy from sustainability. I started in energy from what was required to decarbonize and, perform sustainable results. So I came specifically after recently graduating from university. I worked with an index. We developed an index as entrepreneurs. This was almost 2006, in which we wanted to, from the perspective of assurance, build upon the supply chain of oil and gas companies in terms of providing them a checklist that could enable their sustainability around the supply chains, specifically for those oil and gas companies that were part of the stock change in New York and in different stock markets in Latin America. And also then I started, this was also more than 12 years ago, we started developing the first steps, at least, well, maybe some people were working, of course, on this around the globe, but we started working on designing the financial instruments for urban resilience. So there was this first steps towards climate finance, sustainable finance, everything related to what we see today, blended finance, etc. So this was how I entered the world of energy. Of course, you know that energy has a big footprint, and we'll see this during the presentation. in terms of climate change, sustainability, of course, carbon emissions, decarbonization efforts. So basically, that's the short answer.
Great. Felipe, look, clearly, I mean, it's climate change that we are fighting, and it's climate change that's gonna basically force us to change, and innovation is going to happen. But the scale of this problem is so large that it needs policies and governments to be involved, and not just entrepreneurs to make it happen. And so we are really excited to hear what you are going to share with us now. And so with that, I'll give you the floor. And audience, get ready to get your questions together as you listen, and put them on the chat, and then put your hand up, and then we'll try to draw you into the Q&A section. So with that, Felipe, why don't we get started?
Thank you, Tingra. Please let me know when you see my screen. I'll just share.
We
Yes,
see your
of
screen.
course.
Okay. You see it perfect? Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So we're gonna talk basically about this shifting gears. You know, where we're coming from a world that was basically built upon fossil fuels, and now we're shifting, reindustrializing the economy towards decarbonizing, well, everything related to the industrial manufacturing process, transport, everything. So we're gonna look at what are the main complexities and challenges for this transition to take place. Basically, you see here that the world, well, this is an important message. The world has undertaken energy additions more than energy transitions by the means of technology transitions. You see that before, for example, the 800s, 850, 900, 1900, the world was specifically based the development and manufacture industrial process. Of course, the different, we had the agro-industrial revolution, then we had the industrial revolution, and this has basically taken society and the economies towards more energy requirements that at the end have embraced the need or the demand of higher energy consumption. So what we've done during times has been basically adding new energy rather than shifting or replacing previous energy sources with new energy sources. We see, for example, that renewables today account for about 7%. If we add other renewables, there you see other renewables. What we have here as wind, solar, modern biofuels, wind, hydropower, those are basically what accounts for this 7%. We also see, for example, that nuclear becomes about 4% of the energy consumption by source, and fossil fuel, on the other hand, we see oil, coal, natural gas specifically. That amount accounts for almost 80%, specifically 77% of the energy consumption, and ending the year 2022. So there's a lot of questions behind how our effort is going to move, but basically we have to understand that this this main challenge, of course, faces something which is really important, and is that energy use lifts and has lifted people out of poverty, despite the consumption growth and the population growth. We see, for example, that in India, we had what I do here, well, what we have here is basically on the y-axis, the Human Development Index, and the x-axis, the energy use per capita, where India increased its Human Development Index, which is basically upon levels of life expectancy, education levels. We'll see, for example, everything related to GDP per capita or the gross national income. And India increased from 0.43 to 0.63, of course, going to the right of the graph, meaning more energy consumption. And China, on the other hand, from 1990 had an incredible spike in terms of human development and energy consumption, going from 0.50 to 0.77, with more than 100 gigajoules per capita in their country. We also see, for example, how mean education increased in India by 2.4 times what it was in 1990. We see that life expectancy increased by 8.6 years. And of course, as I mentioned before, this was underpinned by specifically having a higher energy use per capita of 158%. On the other hand, of course, you also see the performance in terms of life expectancy, education levels in China, which, for example, is interesting to note that life expectancy increased for more than a decade. So this is something that we should understand when addressing these challenges. This is basically a graph that shows a little bit of the same, but of course, with more countries where we have not only the low high development index countries, but also the medium high and very high. It's interesting to know that, for example, developed nations and countries, of course, are at the top right of the graph, where US, Norway, Canada, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, well, have all of this amount of energy use per capita, where we're seeing more than 200 gigajoules of consumption. So this means at the end, as you see here, that very high HDI or Human Development Index countries at the end have more than 4x, fourfold the consumption of high human development, in this case, countries, and that high development index countries, for example, we see those that are like with a little lighter blue, China, those kind of countries, are 5 to 6 times more energy have more energy consumption than middle high development medium development index. So this becomes interesting to know that at the end, energy consumption, well, really triggers not only growth in economy, but also, as you see here, development to the nations and lower poverty. Here, interestingly, we see and we can note that not only energy consumption at the end triggers better human development index, better conditions for life. Of course, we see higher life expectancy, but at the end, there's this dilemma that higher CO2 emissions improves the human development index. We see here, for example, a graph that shows the per capita emissions on the left and the human development index, which was the previous metric I was using before. And of course, this has a positive correlation between more per capita emissions, the more human development index, where Singapore, of course, the United Arab Emirates, Brunei, Malta, United States are at the top right. And then we see Mozambique, Pakistan, India, Ghana towards the left, low side of the graph. So what should we do in terms of understanding that this embracing at the end or a development policy and developing your project in terms of development will contribute in a sense to also higher emissions. So this is like a little bit the bad thing of what we're looking at when we talk about development. Of course, we know, and we should note at the end, that the current pledges of Paris, as you know, for global warming, at the end require the world to speed the transition, because at the end, if there's a lot of studies that show that specific target of reaching 1.5 degrees in 2030 is not going to be possible if we do not increase the efforts in 28%. And listen very careful, because what we've done has to be increased at least in 1/3 of the efforts, because if not, in 2030, we're going to reach a temperature that is going to be between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees Celsius. So this becomes really important when addressing these challenges. And when I mentioned 1/3, is 1/3 for the 2 degrees Celsius target, because if we want to get to the 1.5 Celsius target, this means increasing efforts by almost 50%, specifically 42% more of capital, more of projects, more of development that we've done until today. And we're just having very little amount of time. So there's this question: will traditional energy demand and energy stock disappear overnight? So of course, what I mentioned before, we see that population growth is increasing. We'll have an increase of population of almost 2 billion people by 2050. As population growth happens, as economic growth happens, as development, of course, occurs, as we encourage nations to have all of this development initiatives and strategies within their frameworks, policies, and their capital flows. Well, of course, this means at the end having more energy consumption, more energy generation. So this is a big question of how do we bring all of these fossil fuels towards zero? That is the at least the target that was mentioned towards 2050. Oil also, more than just providing all of this metrics that we saw before, because all of the industrial process at the end, and we see here 96% of manufactured products are made of oil. We see electronics, asphalt, renewable energy materials, which of course all of we not only see here oil, but also critical minerals, which we're going to talk about this further. We see medicines, plastic, cosmetics, cleaning products, most of the consumption products we use, and of course the four main blocks of modern consumption, which is ammonia, plastics, everything related to steel and cement. Those blocks are basically built upon the supplier feedstock of oil in a huge sense. So where should we go? If we have all of this, context in terms of the reality of the use of energy, of the sources of the energy, of the efforts towards decarbonizing our economy. So basically what the IEA says and mentions, the International Energy Agency, is that we have to, and you'll see here, for example, 2020, at the right of the graph, while we see today where almost, as I mentioned before, 60 to 70% is provided by by fossil fuels. Well, we have to convert that in 2050 towards, or transition this, not only, again, adding new energy to the matrix of energy generation, but also supplementing or converting the current manufacturing process and industrial process towards the technologies that are provided to decarbonize their production. So this means at 2050, changing or transitioning all those fossil fuels to renewables. And we see that mainly the high projections are basically based on solar, wind, with a share of more than 60%, where additional hydropower, of course, increases at 10%. Then we see a little bit of all the renewables, which hydrogen can be based in that green spot. And then more of nuclear, of course, that has to be based towards the decarbonizing. As we know, for example, Europe included in the taxonomy, in the green taxonomy, nuclear power. And we've seen efforts also in the US with the IRA increasing, of course, the amount of tax credits towards this technology. So at the end, this becomes a huge challenge. And we have, as I mentioned before, very small time, very little time to reach this target. Where are we now? Transformative changes of the global energy system are shifting behaviors. We saw, for example, that in 1975, almost all the fossil fuels provided 70% of the electricity generation. In 2015, it's expected that renewables provide 70% of the electricity generation. That's a huge shift, as I mentioned before. But efforts related to energy efficiency, of course, are also being undertaken. We saw, for example, the annual average of efficiency improved over or less than 1% in 1990. In 2030, it's expected that energy efficiency becomes or improves in more than 2% the efforts of decarbonizing the economy. We also see that advanced economies since the 1975 were the ones who consumed 2/3 of fossil fuels globally. And in 2030, it's expected that the emerging economies, emerging markets, who are the ones that are demanding the higher amounts of energy right now for their growth initiatives, and of course plants, are the ones who are going to demand 2/3 of that fossil fuel globally. So this is why we also see, for example, in Asia, and we'll see this again in other graphs below, how is it so difficult, even though, for example, we see China developing and funneling a lot of resources to renewables. It's very difficult at the end for many emerging growing markets to get rid of that energy stock that supplies the sufficient energy for their growth purposes. So we see that this change or shift in gears at the end is not only changing behaviors, it's changing capital preferences and investment flows. And this is key because we have to know that where capital goes at the end is where real commitment goes. We cannot think about pledges and just signing documents and what governments and ministers at the end are saying at the COPs or at saying a specific event or at saying, for example, in the different meetings they have. When you track capital, is where you see specifically where the money is going. So we see here, for example, that investment flows are decreasing in oil globally. You see the one below this from the IA again. And I'll tell you specifically some of this, which is really interesting. We see natural gas, fossil fuels being, in a sense, divested, although they are keeping their levels and sustaining the levels of production because they have better technologies, such as the shale revolution in the US, which increase the productivity of the wells. We have, of course, increased low emission power investment flows, a lot of capital going to low emission power. We have, of course, also an increase in energy efficiency and electricity grids and battery storage. And there's an increase, and a little increase, but there's an increase also in coal. And of course, we see, for example, that the US today has become the largest producer, not only consumer, but also producer of oil in the world. So, and there at the bottom line, you see a little line of electrification, which also has been increasing a little bit, but that is really important to note. You see above how this scenario of investment flow changes between the regions. So, for example, we see the US that is not decreasing the oil and gas investments, or the gas are decreasing, but specifically the oil are increasing. This is why they became, at the end, the largest producers. The European Union, as you know, are very low dependent on fossil fuels. They really don't have the endowment, so they're building all of this and funneling all of the investment to renewables, specifically also energy efficiency efforts, and importing most of their fossil fuel sources and feedstock. China, on the other hand, with a huge stock, of course, of coal, of low emission power being developed, and then the rest of the world, we see that is basically what I mentioned before. And at the right, it's interesting to note that, and this is like a zoom specifically to the upstream of oil investments by supply segment. So you see, for example, here offshore deep water, offshore shale, the shale, tight oil, the oil sands, the other onshore initiatives. And at the end, this downward performance or this downward oversight of the investments show that at the end, what oil and gas companies are doing is sustaining specifically the amount of production they have. So capital is being provided specifically to sustain the amount of production. That's the first thing. Second is being deployed to pay debt. Oil and gas companies have a huge debt that was not the primary effort of being paid before, but now we see a lot of capital going to pay that debt. And third, of course, to pay dividends. But some of you might ask yourselves if they are investing specifically on renewables and low emission powers. And unfortunately, we don't see a big share of the investment flows and the huge cash flows they have right now being funneled towards renewables. A little bit, but not much. So significant renewable additions by technology. On the other hand, we see here how it has improved at the end. Of course, we see this not only in the investment graph I showed you before, but of course, in the pledges, commitments, and the capital that is being deployed. So at the end, it's interesting to know that a huge stake of what has been done, and this is like a picture of, this is a positive statement. This is not a normative statement. This is what really has happened between 2017 and 2023. We see a lot of distributed and utility photovoltaic energy, in this case solar. Of course, we see offshore and onshore wind being deployed as well. Those are like the main segments of decarbonizing efforts in terms of new renewable capacity additions, some hydropower, bioenergy, and other renewables, again, such as hydrogen or sustainable aviation fuels or other technologies. The problem is that these deployments have been really highly concentrated by region. So if you see here, for example, China, and there's this graph or this map at the left where you see how, well, the size of the graph, of course, shows the size of those investments and deployments. We see how China has a huge share of this new investments in renewables. So yes, when you hear, for example, in events and congresses that the world has invested trillions of dollars in renewable, that has invested or that we have added in capacity of renewables such amount of gigawatts in capacity or gigawatt per hour in terms of power, we have to be very sure at the end that this, when it becomes really concentrated, the ones that are really making the efforts and the equity that it's behind these efforts of decarbonization might not be as forecasted. So this is important at the end to make sure that when you see these figures, you understand how it's being deployed globally. Also, we can see that Latin America, which is not on the graph at the right, but at the left, we see that it has grown about 54 gigawatts. We know I started by this with some of the questions initially, and Latin America's emissions, just for you to know, related to energy sector are only 5%. The matrix of Latin America is mostly renewable, clean. More than 60% of the matrix regionally is clean. And there are countries which, of course, have more than 75% of their energy matrix clean. So at the end, they can provide not only domestic or meet domestic consumption and demand, but also have increasing efforts to supply clean fuels for those countries that have deficitary balances of energy, or at the end require also decarbonizing or decarbonized fuels and technologies. Well, within the net zero capital, we see a gap of 18 trillion through 2030. So this is basically an estimation that has been made by BCG, where basically what it required, as I mentioned before, we have to not only increase the efforts by those 40%, 45% towards the projects capital that we have deployed today. We have to also, of course, increase the speed of the commitments and of the development today. So this involves not only engaging the public sector, which we know this transition specifically is being deployed by the public sector, not the private sector. Usually all of new deployments in energy additions were supplied by innovation, were supplied by efficiency, by productivity, by, of course, profitability, and private sector was the ones that were the ones that were leading the initiatives. Right now is the public sector specifically that is leading this commitment. And the public sector has no money or enough money at the end to supply not only for the energy transition, but for development goals at the end. So we have to crowd in capital investment, and this is why we talk about And you saw this on the spring meetings, maybe at the World Bank and IMF, talking specifically about how do we create new instruments such as bonds, such as blended finance, such as de-risking mechanisms for private capital to come in and make part of this new capital that is required to meet the gap. And also at the right, there's a graph which is interesting to note. And as I mentioned before, not only the concentration of new renewables are being concentrated in regions specifically, we also see that the investments are also being concentrated specifically on advanced economies in China. So what is the key insight here? The money is in the global north, but the natural resources, such as capacity factors of plants, such as renewables, in terms of the capacity of wind, solar to be provided, is in the global south, but there's not enough money. So there's a big question in how do we, have this different provisions being deployed towards emerging economies, because they're the ones that are suffering the most, the most vulnerable to climate change conditions. They have to build, of course, high resilience and adaptation efforts. So how do we fix at the end the requirements of financial capital and the supply or the enough capacity to supply the clean fuels required to decarbonize the world? We also at the end, and with this I end basically the challenges, and is basically understanding that this is also supported on a lot of geopolitical instability. We see that most of the initiatives that are being deployed specifically by governments today, there's a heightened competition. We see, for example, the US-China competition. We see how the Europe is trying to have more diversified and resilient supply chains, specifically for minerals, critical minerals, chips, all of the CHIPS Act also in the US related to technology development. How do we see, for example, new players in the world of energy, such as Guyana providing oil to the world? So at the end, this is making all of these strategic partnerships to be deployed around the world. And we see China today having the grip of not only the extraction, but also specifically and most of all the processing of critical minerals required for the transition, because most of the minerals are going to be used to develop, manufacture the technologies, the infrastructure that are going to be required to develop and deploy the renewables that must meet the targets towards 2030 and 2050. So yeah, basically those are the main challenges, as we saw: geopolitical stability, financing the transition, the everything related to the fossil fuel phase out or phase down in some countries that are, of course, prioritizing accessibility, affordability over sustainability. We see, for example, that Africa cannot make the transition because most of their population is not hasn't got energy at all, or is not being electrified at the end. So accessibility, affordability, sustainability, that trilemma is very important. And I open the floor, of course, for any question and for any feedback specifically.
Felipe, thank you very much. Great presentation, great insights. If you want to stop presenting, we'll put some talking heads and get people to see who's talking and everything else. So if you stop presenting, that'd be great. And then what we can do is, of course, take your details and all that and post it on the chat so everybody can see it. And we'll do that. Okay. So Felipe, first of all, this is very insightful for me, for sure. There were a couple of thoughts as you presented. The first one was very clear to me that no energy that we have identified in the past has gone away. The idea, all that energy continues while new energy sources are created and identified and whatever. So oil and gas is there, nuclear is there, hydroelectric is there, And now if we go to solar and wind, all the others remain. What is the reason in your understanding why they continue? Is it because they are able to be price competitive? Or is it because the demand in the world continues to be so excessive that there is no way that any new technology is able to build up the capacity needed to replace the others affordably quickly?
Yeah, great question. And specifically, well, as I mentioned before, as population increases and grows and economic development grows and development initiatives are more pressing towards the world nations and everything, of course, this demand higher energy capacity, higher energy consumption, because at the end, our society is been built upon energy supply. And we see that the big stock, the lion's share of the energy matrix at the end is being provided by fossil fuels. So all of the energy that is being developed at the end, as we see here, for example, for renewables, are not specifically substituting the previous energy stock that we have. They are basically adding new energy to the global matrix. If we go specifically to a local domestic market, we might see that their matrix might shift a little bit with higher shares of renewables, with higher shares of maybe fossil fuels. There are nuances between countries, but in the global spectrum, you're right. It's addition and it's not transition.
That's pretty insightful, and it brings to mind that at the end of the day, somehow the lowest cost energy source will drive the survival or the arrival of new technologies, and they will always have to be the lowest price with whichever source that is. And do you believe that oil and gas will continue being the driver of price of energy, or will there be another energy source like solar or wind which will drop down faster than oil and gas?
Well, that question can be solved when you go to any base load for any utility. At the end, when you start seeing how those base loads are being built in those stacks within the different countries, of course, we see that the economic principle is the first, then the impact. When you have a specific requirements or national requirements to have quotas of renewables within the baseload. But specifically, those baseloads are built upon the most cheap and reliable sources, which are going to be fossil fuels. And I think that this is gonna be like this at the end, as you mentioned. This is gonna prevail for a long time. I think definitely we have to find the means towards, as you know, for example, we talk about energy density by volumetric units or by mass units. And whenever we find a substitute that can provide enough energy to have a lower share of fossil fuels, but provide the reliability and the affordability of that energy towards the consumption levels that we have right now, that is the moment when we can trigger the change, really. Nuclear at the end, and this is important. For example, in the US, of course, nuclear is part of the baseload. Not all the countries have nuclear power. Not all the countries have the capabilities to provide this source of energy. But this is also part of the mix that can also be enhanced in a sense.
I see questions coming up, so I'm gonna just basically I want to make one point. Many of these energy sources, whether it's oil and gas or hydroelectric, the capital cost has already been invested in, and therefore they are only operating on operating expenses. While new technologies are coming and they have to put in the capex and the opex, right? And so one is competing capex versus opex just to get the game started. And the question I have is, what is the very bottom for oil and gas opex? Which is, they can continue reducing the price down to, which is what will be the threshold price for competition for solar energy or anything else as they think of bundling the capex and the opex together over some time frame to be competitive. Because oil and gas, there's no reason for a country who's found oil or gas in their country to stop producing. It's money. So there is no incentive for them to really give that up unless they are given a check from somebody or something else. And so one thing is to just make them uncompetitive. And so what is that from your research? Is there a number that you guys have found, which is like saying everybody aim for this number and you aim for this number and carbon will go to zero? What is that number?
If we had that number, that is the solution everyone is looking for. But at the end, it's important to think that if emissions, and I don't talk only about CO2, but also about GHG emissions, are not priced in fossil fuels, we don't have a specific harmonized global carbon pricing mechanisms, including, of course, methane and all of the other gases, that will not reduce the competitiveness of the fossil fuels. And that would not be, at the end, the motive, that would not incentivize, at the end, the fossil fuel phase out from specific countries that are producing the oil and gas. And specifically, we see something here as well. And some of you might see the interview that it became viral from Guyana's president talking to the BBC, where the BBC journalist asked the president specifically the following. And he said, you're going to produce this amount of oil, which is really big. You're not concerned of the emissions you're going to deploy to our atmosphere? He was filming from the UK specifically. Well, the president just answered in a terrific way and manner. And it was saying and talking about the hypocrisy behind all of this efforts, and there's that basically the global south has protected and conserved biodiversity, the Amazon, everything related to natural carbon capture technologies that are required and that they haven't been paid by the global nations, by developed nations to protect these natural resources and technologies. And now they discover and explore this resource that they are consuming at the north or at the developed nations at the end, or developing nations, which is priced today almost at $100 the barrel. And that is taking right now Guyana to triplicate the GDP per capita in the last 5 years. So imagine the connotation
Perfect.
of making that decision. Okay,
that's a perfect example. So let me ask the question. You showed two graphs which I found fascinating. One graph was showing that the consumption or the emissions per capita of poor countries is far less than of rich countries. But as they improve the quality of life, they consume more energy. So the conclusion for me is eventually people from wealthier countries and poor countries will need to use the same amount of energy if they're going to be competitive in productivity and everything else. So energy is a good index, a human index of your wealth of your country, of your productivity. So as the rich countries, which are emitting a lot per capita, the poor countries are not emitting a lot per capita, both have to, one's going to go up because it needs to, just to be competitive. The other one will need to go down to save the planet, because it's got to figure out science and technology to use less per capita. And therefore, it will really break across on this level. And therefore, the burden of solutions, technology solutions, investments, and all that, unfortunately, will probably fall on the back of wealthier nations. Is that baked into your Colombia policy strategy?
Well, for Colombia specifically, strategy, when we talk about development index, of course, we think and in policy and energy policy in Colombia, and I think this is, of course, the driver for most of the developing nations, is that energy poverty, affordability, accessibility is key. So you're not talking about the kind or the source of the energy. You're not talking about prioritizing sustainability of energy. We're talking specifically of electrifying households, electrifying societies, electrifying people, well, the means for people to enhance their development standards. So it's important to note that this is basically something that I think, of course, we'll see is not gonna, in developing nations, at least I think, is not gonna be or have this mentality of reducing energy per capita. Huge efforts, not only specifically related to CapEx development for new renewables to be deployed, but specifically for energy efficiency, which is a big chunk and share of what efforts, where efforts must be deployed. I think is part of what developing nations such as Colombia must do, and of course policies are being built upon this initiative. You're muted.
We're going to stop for a minute for our institutional video, and then we'll take questions from Bob, Cristanto, and Vincent next. Let's take a minute for institutional video. Okay. Please hang in there, come back, wait for us for another 30 seconds.
Hello, my name is Hitendra Patel. I'm the Managing Director of the Global Innovation Management Institute. I'd like to welcome you and join our vision and our mission of the Institute. Our vision is to democratize innovation everywhere. In organizations like universities or corporations, in high schools, in governments. And the idea is to unleash that creativity across the globe. Our mission is much more simpler. To train 1 million people worldwide, certify them, and unleash their creativity and their problem-solving skills to target any problem on this planet. The Global Innovation Management Institute has got certifications for individuals, for corporations, as well as for the government. And the whole idea over here is through certifications, people have the right to practice innovation. Through certifications, we create a roadmap for how to get better and improve as we get level 1 certificate to level 2 to level 3. We are today working with the Dubai government, the Qatar government, across Colombia, in Brazil, in the United States, helping these institutes and these countries become better in terms of their innovation journeys. We're working with corporations, giving them roadmaps, how they can go from level 1 to level 2. And we're giving certificates to individuals as they go from level 1, 2, 3, and 4 in terms of how they can actually innovate themselves, how they can innovate in teams, and how they can innovate in a company.
We've worked with several innovation consultancies, and we found the GIMI methodology to be able to help us democratize innovation very quickly across large groups of people.
Curriculum isn't enough anymore. We need to really be finding ways to expand the school into the community and bring the communities into the school. And design thinking and the GIMI impact model is what's going to help do that. I think that we really need to start looking for authentic, experiential learning opportunities for our students. And this is a really great framework that teachers can use that makes it easy to do.
The value that we see being part of the GIMI program is that we can offer capability building for students, for professionals, for corporations, and that's really exciting to be able to create a language that can help everybody connect with what strategic innovation is.
Today we've got 25 countries who are partners of the Global Innovation Management Institute. We'd like to see all 195 plus countries becoming part of this institute. So we are looking for training partners across the globe. We're looking for university partners in every one of those countries so they can be part of our network. And we would like to see companies and corporations around the world all embracing the certification programs of GIMI. And as a result, we can target any problem and we can solve any problem. Join us on our mission through certificates to give people the right to practice and a roadmap of how to improve.
Great, Felipe. Why don't we invite Bob to add a question? And Bob, you have the air, and introduce yourself, where you're from, and what's your question. And we got 3 other questions also, Felipe. So try and do it this in 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute if you can.
Okay, I'll try.
Dr. Bob Schultz, Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. My students have been in the Innovation Olympics for about 8 years now, and it's just a phenomenal experience. And now the rest of the world, including the University of Calgary, is beginning to catch up and realize we have to do more and connect with GIMI even more. Attender, you look great. So for my friends, I had some health issues, but they seem to be resolved now. A question. If you look at India and China, they're replacing coal with natural gas. They put the pipelines in, and those pipelines aren't going to go away. And so so the emissions targets that they have are going to get pushed out to 2050 as a hope. So people are making those commitments aren't going to be around when China, in my opinion, isn't going to meet the targets. The second is that if you look at solar, you don't have full cycle of what's going to happen for reclaiming the solar panels now. So you need to have recovery there. And number 3 is we're talking about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. And the original plan was only on scope 1. So there's a coming to recognition that maybe this isn't going to work. And so now what do we do? Where we are in Calgary as an energy center, we like to be a hub or a spoke on where we're going globally here. Felipe, I've got lots of connections that would want to connect up with you. And then when I visit New Jersey in the summer, go see Attendra, I'll drop in New York and see you as well.
Absolutely.
So
amazing.
help me out here. And how close am I to where we're going? That where we're going isn't going to work. Not enough money, not enough technology, not enough time.
You're
And
right.
hydrogen you show is very small. For a lot of people where I am are putting their money thinking that hydrogen is going to work through ammonia transfers out of natural gas.
I agree.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
It's basically, you mentioned it. It's very clear.
Let's hear Crisanto, see what he has to say from Indonesia then.
Crisanto, please share, introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from.
Hello, Felipe. Thank you for your presentation. Kristanto from Jakarta, Indonesia. So, learning from your graphs, it's quite clear to me that I think China is leading the world on the energy transition into renewables. But they are not the richest one, the richest country. They are not the one with the human development, very high human development index. Their investment is not the biggest one, but if you look at the result and ratio to investment, I think they are doing better than others. So my question is, how do we as a country learn 2-3 points that has made China successful in transitioning their energy into renewables? Because I don't think China is lacking in oil, and they have also large deposit of coal, but still, they're still importing coal from Indonesia. And they're dominating investment in nickel in Indonesia like, you see, like crazy, I think. But now I can understand that they are actually very serious investing in nickel because of the battery industry. And they're also offering very quickly on the electric vehicles. 2-3 companies are simultaneously offering to invest in Indonesia in EV, which I think is part of the policy to use renewable energy. So how do we learn from China? Thank you, Felipe.
Yeah, well, China has made a lot of things as a national strategy. I think that one important aspect of their policies that maybe many nations do not have is the continuity of their strategy, of their national strategy. And this is because they have only one party. This is the paradoxical thing between having only one party and having different parties in a democratic state. But at the end, they have been able to have long-term commitments. Unfortunately, we see, for example, that in many Western nations, it depends on the government that it's in turn. So yes, we can have the IRA, for example, in the US today, but maybe not tomorrow. for the benefits or the credits that are being deployed. So I think this is one element. Second, China has been able to deploy within this strategy tactical initiatives to gather, concentrate, and have the grip of supply chains. Everything related to what is required to develop, manufacture, and increase the geopolitical influence with this grip at the end and this amount of resources they have, providing, of course, the resources and the capital for the transition, not only to be built domestically in China, but also to have many nations dependent on them to provide those resources. And this is why protectionism today, and I will add to what was previously mentioned by Bob, and is we have heightened protectionism, we have heightened tensions in terms of having all of these border mechanisms, of having this prioritized developments and incentives for domestic production and consumption. So this also, of course, undermines the transition. But basically, talking again about China, the second one will be having the grip of supply chains, and the third one is the deeds doing more than what they say. So of course they say and they mention and they come to the congresses and they meet and they talk about what they're doing, but at the same time, simultaneously, they're building and they're building massively. China is building today a manufacturing EV capacity that is the same size of the global demand.
Yeah.
So, the amount, the size here, when we talk about China, is just massive. It's just incredibly high. It's, when we talk about photovoltaic, when we talk about wind, when we talk about solar, when we talk about EVs, it's just massive. So that would be the third one.
So Felipe, Cristanto, we are at 10 o'clock. And what I would like to do is ask our our members to continue staying on. And we'll formally close this thing off in about 2 minutes or 3 minutes. We'll take the question from Vincent and then carry on. But we will, for those who have to leave, thank you very much for attending. We'll continue right now. Vincent, why don't we give you that question? Felipe, if you're okay with answering some more questions.
Yeah, no problem. 3 minutes more, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the floor. Great presentation, Felipe. I just wanted to pick up from some of your points and some that I picked up from the chat. From the point of view of a developing economy, of course, we welcome new technologies. Hitander's been very big on hydrogen. That said, I think the determinants of whether these technologies are taken up are still, the risk of the technology. If it's too new, the less likelihood. Of course, the supply chain. I mean, if it's something like LNG or in the case of hydrogen, similar infrastructure that's needed by the supply chain. And the other is, of course, affordability. And the reason that developing economies are still using fossil fuel, although there is movement towards obviously renewable energy. As Bob mentioned earlier, in many of these economies, we do look at LNG, although that is a fossil fuel. We look at that as an intermediate renewable energies. It's relatively cleaner, right, and still has that base load power. So I just wanted to bring up that the considerations for a developing economy is quite different, right? But I'm very glad that you considered a lot of developing economies in your presentation and research.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think this is part of the challenges, of the huge challenges we have to understand when engaging in, not only in policy, but also in developing and funneling capital, because at the end, as I mentioned before, Global South have different, challenges, commitments. They're engaging in development, in getting people out of poverty, in providing not only the means to electrify their economies, but also to provide food at the end, clean food. So this is important. On the Global South, they're thinking about, of course, having and engaging with all of what I mentioned before, keeping their growth rates and having more share of the trade, etc. So at the end, I think this is part of the trade-offs between this trilemma of affordability, sustainability, and of course equity, to be able to deploy a clean and just transition, because the term just transition is fundamental. And when we talk about just transition, is also understanding the nuances between the different regions. Before, also, I wanted to include something that to complement what Bob initially mentioned, that I said that I agree. But of course, we have to understand that the transition, everyone mentioned, or not everyone, but many people mentioned that the transition might happen. It could happen. It could happen within 100, 200, 300 years. It doesn't matter. The problem is the slope. It has to be really steep. That means we have to do it in a very short period of time. And that is a huge challenge that we must keep moving forward.
Felipe, I have one last question and then we wrap it up. We're working a lot with green hydrogen and trying to figure out what does it take to make green hydrogen as an industry evolve and become the next layer of energy on top of the energy that you have, right? And green energy is actually powered by solar and wind. So solar and wind will grow if green hydrogen happens. And green hydrogen is really just a storage device for energy that you can move around from one point A to point B as hydrogen or ammonia, right? It can be moved around. So the question is, the Europeans obviously are all worried about carbon footprint and all that kind of stuff. And they've said, we'll buy X percentage of all the hydrogen in the world in the next 5, 10 years, 50%. The numbers are huge. And they said, but we'll buy for $1. And the current price of it to produce it is about $4. So if a country wants to become a net exporter, there's an opportunity to export to Europe. So they think about that. But the $4 has to be subsidized, irrespective, by somebody. If the Europeans are going to get it for $1. The Europeans are very smart, and they're making a bet saying, you guys figure it out, we'll buy for $1. But if you have to subsidize it, you subsidize it on your side. So in those subsidy models and business models, what models have you seen that allows a new technology to somehow start coming to the market, subsidize the capital investments? Because once you go past the capital investments, that $4 does drop. Right?
Yes.
What are the subsidy models that you've seen?
Well, this is important at the end, because we see, for example, and just to we're part of the premises within the IRA. You see that in the US, where subsidies go almost to $3 per kilogram. And if you have the $4 and you take, $3 where you get the $1.
You got it.
Yeah. So that's part of the something that was previously forecasted. Although, of course, we see that those tax incentives, in this case of this policy, are being also deployed basically by building and developing hydrogen is manufactured. It's converting electrons to molecules. So at the end, it's basically incentivizing that this manufacturing process occurs domestically in the US. And of course, this has many connotations that at the end we have to think about, because the grid, if you're going to provide, for example, hydrogen from the grid, not specifically from renewable capacities themselves, but from the grid, you're going to have a very dirty hydrogen. So this is part of what it has to be diversified in a sense. But more than that, for example, I'll talk about Colombia, that as I mentioned before, I'm currently leading the draft bill for hydrogen economy, and just making a benchmark. Also, I worked before with a company that was basically the leader in terms of strategy consulting for renewables and hydrogen. And what we see here specifically is that there's you can, from engineering, of course, capacity factors for renewables, you can understand what is the potential of each nation and country in providing that renewable power. So, for example, we have offshore capacities in the north of Colombia of more than 50 gigawatts that is not being developed today, but it has that potential. And we can have hydrogen that can be provided between the $1 and $1.5 per kilogram. But we need scale. we need projects, we need development, we need to test the technology, we need, above all, off-takers. We need the demand to be able at the end to meet the supply and of course be able to afford the prices. So how do we do this? I think this is part of the questions that are being solved right now within many congresses that are and meetings that are taking place, as I mentioned also in the presentation, to finance not only hydrogen development, but to finance development as a whole. Why? Because public capital is not enough to provide the subsidies to introduce new technologies and de-risk investments for new projects to be built, and demand also to come and take or off-take that provision. So when we have, and this is what is part of the discussion, is how do we crowd in more private capital? How do we incentivize capital markets to provide new instruments that are basically meeting these requirements of de-risking investments, not only, again, for producers and developers, but also incentivizing consumptions. We also see, for example, that from policies, you can also include more than subsidies, you can include quotas, having quotas, for example, in blended gas, where the gas, you decarbonize the gas. It might not be very efficient, of course. There's a huge energy loss, but at the end, you can include a quota of 10%. We've seen quotas of 20%, for example, in Europe, of introducing green hydrogen. So those are part of the instruments that you can have. But at the end, as I mentioned in one of my slides, we have to make sure that capital is funneled where it is required and incentivized. If capital does not move with your mouth, we won't see change occur.
Felipe, thank you very much. What a great, insightful set of discussions, slides and presentations. People are commenting. The graphs provoked a lot of interest and understanding of what's going on in the world. And I think if your mission is to say this is important, I think you were able to transfer that knowledge quite effectively, efficiently today. I would like to always welcome you back to our think tank and contribute, and also invite you to be part of any of the projects that are going on in our community, to say that, look, I would like to help or be an expert or provide some insights. And so share your information and involve yourself in all this great stuff. What I want to do is just give you the last minute. The last minute is to tell the people what is it that you would like them to do to help you achieve your objectives. What can they do?
Thank you, and again, very grateful for the space and being part of this initiative. I'll tell you maybe one thing that has been my motor at the end, my engine in these commitments, and is basically, first, not being indifferent, understanding the challenges, understanding what is really happening, understanding that many times having global governance is sometimes impossible, but we must keep our efforts moving. And climate change implies having a global governance, in this case, not only in terms of policies again, but of private incentives, of private developments, of private and institutional commitment. So I think we must keep our efforts moving. We must, for all of those like me that are in energy for climate, we should keep moving. We should engage not only in conversation with project developers. We must make part of the conversations that are being developed and taken in the policy scene, also in the multi-sectorial and development initiatives. And when I talk about this, of course, is talking about multilateralism. We have to make part of those discussions and engage nations and engage finance and engage developers and engage policymakers towards moving forward with these commissions, because at the end, if we don't achieve the targets, well, we just will lose life and biodiversity in our planet.
Felipe, thank you very much. I think you're sending a warning to all of us that climate change is coming, and the slope at which we need to transition from where we are into the next transition of energies is much steeper than people believe. Stop being complacent, start doing something now, and contribute to science, technology, and everything else. Our community is made up of scientists, technologists, policymakers, corporate innovation, the managers, directors, institutions, academia. So we've got a great network of people, and the message has gone out. And our philosophy is this is one of those problems, it's a systems problem. And so we need to bring everybody together and align and point on the North Star and get excited, engage excited, and committed into this direction to make this thing happen. And so our philosophy at the end of every meeting is we say, problems, any problem in the world can be solved. Together, we can and we will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.